Here we are, my friends. Japan in the late 1980s. The sunset of one of the strangest, most beautiful, and most eventful decades in modern history. And this nostalgic train we're riding on, not slowing down. This year brings political shakeups, one of the most ambitious airport construction projects ever attempted, a VHS tape that had thousands of Japanese driving their cars sideways, the debut of what might just be the most bizarre adventure Japan has ever produced, one of the most underrated game consoles Japan has ever produced, and the release of a fantasy that was anything but final. And despite what I literally just said a minute ago about trains not stopping, we're also marking the end of a railway operation that had shaped an entire nation for more than a century. All of that and a whole lot more is waiting for you in Timeline Japan 1987. So buckle up for a wild nostalgic ride through a year where confidence was sky high, the future felt unstoppable, and the cracks were just starting to show. And hey, if you end up having a good time here, then give that lonely little like button some love, subscribe if you want to join us on future trips down Japanese memory lane, and check out the Patreon right here if you want these journeys ad-free for as little as $1 per month. Anyway, how do we usually start these? Oh yeah, ikimashou. Let's do this. 1987 comes sliding into view completely sideways, tires screaming, smoke in the air, and with style for days. On January 1st, well, allegedly January 1st, a humble VHS tape called Pluspy started appearing on the shelves of Japanese car tuning shops. That exact date, by the way, almost certainly just a placeholder, but it's the only specific one I could find. But Pluspy did certainly release sometime in 1987. Honestly, there was no way I would not include this thing. This unassuming little low-budget VHS tape starred a certain Tsuchiya Keiichi behind the wheel of the now legendary Toyota AE86 Corolla, the beloved Hachirōku. But what made Pluspy so special wasn't the car, it was how Tsuchiya drove it and where. Because instead of a racetrack, because let's face it, anyone with enough money can rent track time, Tsuchiya took his Hachirōku to the Toge, Japan's winding mountain passes. And instead of attacking corners the normal way, he relied on a skill he'd been quietly developing for more than a decade at that point. He drifted. Today, drifting is of course inseparable from Japan's motorsports image. Almost as if driving sideways is the norm in the land of the rising sun. But in 1987, outside of a small circle of Toge racers who already knew Tsuchiya's reputation, this was something entirely new. And that is exactly why Pluspy, despite its low budget, spread like wildfire through word of mouth. No one had seen anything like it. By the time the tape received 2 sequels, Tsuchiya Keiichi had already crossed into legend. They called him the Drift King. From there, drifting exploded, first across Japan, then worldwide as Pluspy made its way overseas. Today, drifting is a full-on legitimate motorsport celebrated globally. But there's a very real argument to be made that none of that happens without this one scrappy little Japanese VHS tape released sometime in 1987. But from scraping together a low-budget VHS tape to absolutely splashing the cash, on January 27th, construction officially began on Kansai International Airport in Osaka Prefecture, also known as KIX. This wasn't just another airport. It was set to become the first offshore airport ever built entirely on an artificial island. Which sounds amazing, and it was, but it also meant insane engineering challenges. Because hey, building an island in the middle of Osaka Bay turned out to require ridiculous amounts of planning, labor, and of course cash. After 20 years of planning, 10,000 workers, 80 ships, and roughly 10 million man-hours, Kansai International Airport finally became a reality. The total cost? An estimated $15 billion, making this the most expensive civil engineering project in modern history at the time. Just the bridge connecting the airport to the mainland alone cost $1 billion. I mean, Jesus. KIX then finally opened in September of 1994, more than 7 years after construction began. And despite a somewhat rocky start, it proved its worth and became one of Japan's busiest airports. The real flex, however, came in January of 1995, when a great Hanjin earthquake devastated the surrounding region. The airport itself, though, largely unharmed. An engineering miracle, an absurdly ambitious project, and a perfect snapshot of how Japan in 1987 maybe had slightly too much money lying around. And speaking of cash, money, moolah, the root of all evil, on February 9th, Japanese telecommunications giant NTT listed its shares on the stock exchange, 2 years after being privatized under Prime Minister Nakasone. Sounds boring? Sure does, but stick with me here. Because at the time, NTT's initial public offering was the largest in world history. One share initially sold for 1.197 million yen, and within 2 months, it peaked at 3 million yen per share. At its peak, NTT became the largest company on Earth by market capitalization, valued at over $350 billion, which made it larger than America's 8 biggest corporations at the time combined. No, seriously. And NTT wasn't alone, because 2 other major privatizations came under Nakasone: Japan Tobacco, and of course Japan National Railways. And on March 31st, 1987, Japan National Railways officially ceased operations, bringing an end to 115 years of state-run railway history in Japan. A lineage stretching back to the first government railways of the 1870s and the post-war creation of JNR in 1949. But the following day, on April 1st, a new era was about to begin. JNR was split into 6 regional passenger companies and 1 freight company, collectively known as the JR Group. So what did this actually mean? Well, the human cost was enormous. Around 80,000 people lost their jobs directly due to privatization, an unprecedented number in Japan at the time. And between 1980 and 1994, the company's number of employees fell from 400,000 to just 191,000. But financially, the results were undeniable. Passenger numbers rebounded quickly, up 20% within 6 years, and freight traffic followed suit. Simultaneously, unprofitable rural lines were shed, which allowed local communities to take over operations themselves, which is not a bad idea, you gotta admit. The transition from JNR to JR was painful, controversial, and deeply disruptive in some ways, but it also reshaped Japan's railways into one of the most admired systems on Earth. And honestly, who doesn't love riding a train in Japan these days?
コマーシャルタイムです。
俺はシティハンターサイバリをはっきり言ってよスタンレールックス2枚美女を見るとすぐにもっこり銃の腕は超一流狙った獲物は外さない人類最大のヒーローだ都会の悪は俺に任せな美女の依頼を
From transport to motorsport, on April 12th, Nakajima Satoru made history by debuting as the first Japanese driver to ever compete full-time in Formula 1. And he earned it too, because between 1981 and 1986, Nakajima had dominated the Formula 2 championship, and so moving up to F1 seemed inevitable. Car manufacturer Lotus agreed, and in 1987 signed him to partner up with none other than the late great Ayrton Senna, who would of course go on to become one of the greatest drivers in motorsport history. Yes, Senna completely overshadowed Nakajima in terms of results, and critics argued Nakajima's seat existed largely because he brought Honda engines with him, engines that Lotus desperately wanted. But politics aside, Nakajima was there. And across 5 seasons, 3 with Lotus and 2 with Tyrrell, he made 74 starts and scored 16 career points. Not legendary by any means, but absolutely respectable. More importantly, Japan finally had a driver on the grid. Until then, Japan built engines and hosted races. But now it raced. A milestone moment in Japanese motorsport, and not the last time Formula 1 would matter in Japan of 1987. On May 10th, Japan lost Hirasawa Sadamichi, a respected painter who spent the final 32 years of his life on death row, despite serious and persistent doubts about his guilt. This story begins in 1948, when a man posing as an epidemiologist entered a Tokyo branch of the Imperial Bank. Claiming to act under orders from the US occupation authorities, he distributed pills and liquid that turned out to be poison, killing 12 of the bank's 16 employees. The perpetrator fled with only a small amount of money, leaving most of it behind. Then, following a trail of business cards, police eventually arrested Hirasawa, largely on circumstantial evidence and a confession he later retracted. That confession was already quite questionable, because Hirasawa suffered from Korsakoff syndrome, a neurological condition that can affect memory and judgment. Beyond that, the case was just full of holes. Police sketches barely resembled the guy. The poison used was believed to be military grade, something a civilian painter should not have been able to obtain. Still, in 1950, Hirasawa was sentenced to death. The ruling was then upheld in 1955, but he was never executed. For more than 3 decades, not a single Minister of Justice would sign his death warrant, each unwilling to take responsibility for ending a life they were not convinced was guilty. And so Hirasawa remained in prison, stuck in a legal purgatory, neither freed nor executed. He died behind bars on May 10th, 1987. His adopted son continued to fight for a retrial long after his father's death, but the case was eventually closed. Unresolved, controversial, and still haunting Japanese legal history to this day. But now, for something much gentler. On June 1st, Asahi Terebi debuted a humble little program called Sekai no Shasou Kara, or See the World by Train. It was a simple little concept. 5 minutes per episode, Monday to Friday, experiencing the world through the train window. One region at a time, without any rush, no spectacle, just vibes and trains. That simple yet genius idea came from producer Okabe Kenji, who wanted the Japanese to have something purely enjoyable to watch on television every single day. Then he realized that the world's railway networks totaled around 1.2 million kilometers, more than enough material for daily television. And so he pitched his concept and started See the World by Train, giving his directors nothing more than a few simple pointers. No location scouting, travel by train, film the scenery from the train window, and, above all, enjoy the journey. The show became a classic. Still airing today with the same narrator since episode 1 no less, it passed 10,000 episodes in 2014, covering 104 different countries and traveling around 750,000 kilometers, roughly the equivalent of circling the entire Earth 19 times. At this pace, they might eventually run out of tracks, but until then, it perfectly explains why Japan loves trains so much. But that deep-rooted love for trains, and honestly anything that requires electricity, had to be briefly put on hold on July 3rd, 1987, when Tokyo and its surrounding regions were hit by a massive blackout. At the time, Tokyo was in the middle of a heat wave. Not exactly unusual, because Tokyo's summers are famously brutal, but on that day, the heat pushed electricity demands over the edge. fans, air conditioners, everything running at once. The power grid simply couldn't take it anymore. Overworked power grid, burned out, I can relate. The result, around 2.8 million households lost power across northern and southern Tokyo, southern Saitama, western Kanagawa, eastern Shizuoka, southern Yamanashi, and northern Chiba. The one small mercy, this all happened at 1:19 p.m., not in the dead of night. Still, it was kind of chaotic. People were stuck in elevators, traffic lights went dark, trains were delayed or suspended, and somewhere out there, more than a few Famicom sessions were tragically interrupted before passwords could be written down. Catastrophic? Maybe not. Mildly infuriating? Absolutely. Power was restored in Tokyo within 20 minutes, though some surrounding areas waited nearly 2 hours. Thankfully, no injuries were reported, and measures were quickly put in place to prevent something like this from happening again. And here's a fun fact. Earlier that same year, a movie titled Tokyo Blackout had been released. Foreshadowing much?
Hachi というか、末広がりのハチ。どうだね、ハチ公。ハチ。
August 7th then marked the end of an era in post-war Japanese politics with the death of Kishi Nobusuke at the age of 90. Kishi, grandfather of future Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, by the way, was one of the most powerful figures of Japan's immediate post-war period. And also one of its more controversial. After World War II, he was imprisoned at Sugamo as a suspected Class A war criminal. He was then released in 1952, elected to the National Diet just a year later, and soon helped establish the Liberal Democratic Party that would dominate Japanese politics for decades. As for his own time as Prime Minister of Japan in the late 1950s, pretty turbulent. It was his mishandling of the revised US-Japan Security Treaty which sparked the Anpo protests, the largest mass protests in modern Japanese history, which also ultimately forced his early resignation in July of 1960. Oh, and he had some ties to the Yakuza as well, and survived an assassination attempt one day before resigning. Yeah, post-war Japan was pretty intense, and by 1987, Kishi was one of the last living symbols of that chaotic, formative era. For better or for worse, a man whose influence helped shape Japan's political and economic trajectory. And with his death, it truly felt like the old guard was finally passing from the scene. Just 3 days later, on August 10th, Japan gained one of its most enduring and unquestionably most bizarre series of manga. Jojo no Kimyo na Boken, better known as Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, debuted with its first volume titled Dio the Invader. Invaded is the key word here. This marked the beginning of the Phantom Blood arc, the first of what would eventually become 9 distinct story arcs as of the making of this video, each starring a new protagonist of the Joestar family, whose first name somehow always shortens to, well, Jojo. That first arc takes place in a very bizarre version of late 19th century England, where Jonathan Joestar faces off against his adopted brother Dio, who's desperately trying to usurp the position of heir to the Joestar family. Yes, Jonathan Joestar is this dude's actual name, and yes, this series absolutely frickin' rules. 8 more story arcs, over 130 manga volumes, OVAs, a movie, multiple anime adaptations, and even some genuinely solid video games later, JoJo's is a certified classic. Its art style, storytelling, and endlessly memeable moments haven't just survived nearly 4 decades, they still feel fresh. May it never end. And speaking of JoJo's, you know who gets referenced a lot in that series? Michael frickin' Jackson. And wouldn't you know it, on September 9th, the king of pop arrived in Japan as a solo artist for the very first time. He wasn't there for a relaxing holiday, of course. He was there for his first couple of dates of his legendary Bad Tour, which began with a 14-day run across Japan. The first concert of the tour was about to take place just 3 days later at Korakuen Stadium in Tokyo, and Michael Jackson's arrival at Narita Airport was pure chaos. Over 300 reporters were on hand, alongside massive crowds of fans who also hoped for a glimpse. You know, classic MJ stuff. Then, after 3 shows in Tokyo, the tour continued through Nishinomiya, Yokohama, and finally Osaka, where MJ also received the key to the city from Mayor Oshima Yasushi while sipping on locally grown green tea. Absolute baller move. Oh, and his monkey, Bubbles, was there too. Michael Jackson's monkey, that is, not the Osaka mayor's, I think. Beyond the spectacle, MJ also donated $20,000 to the family of Hagiwara Yoshiaki, a 5-year-old kidnapping victim, and also contributed personal items to charity auctions before leaving Japan. The Japan leg of the Bad Tour ended up drawing in 570,000 attendees, nearly 3 times the previous tour attendance record in Japan. Fans were happy, the media ate it up, charity benefited. Not a bad tour at all, despite what its name might imply.
コマーシャルタイムです。
なんかいるんじゃない？
嫌な虫にはダニアース、カーペットに畳にひと吹き。
お部屋にダニアース。
オタク大丈夫？
A not so bad, and honestly kind of underrated game console joined the party on October 30th. Not from Nintendo, not from Sega, but from NEC. Yeah, remember them? The console in question was of course the PC Engine, known overseas as the TurboGrafx 16, which, let's be real, is a way cooler name. Developed by Hudson Soft and manufactured by NEC, this was a killer collaboration. Hudson Soft was riding high with hits like Bomberman, Adventure Island, and Star Soldier. NEC, meanwhile, was one of the world's largest semiconductor and PC manufacturers. The result? A compact powerhouse that Japanese gamers embraced immediately. The PC Engine boasted banger titles like Bonk's Revenge, Bomberman, frickin' R-Type. This thing handily outperformed Nintendo's Famicom in graphics and sound too, and for a little while, it was the biggest threat to Nintendo's dominance in Japan. And not only was this thing kinda good, it was ahead of its time in many ways too, because the real magic came a year later when the PC Engine received the CD-ROM add-on. Yes, that's actually how you say it, becoming the first home console to ever use CDs as a storage medium. Across its 7-year lifespan, nearly 700 games were released for the PC Engine, and while it struggled in the US and never made it to Europe in a big way, it remains a landmark in gaming history. I think it deserved way better, and its 1987 release absolutely deserves its place as one of the most important pop culture moments of the year. And so does this. On November 1st, 1987, Formula 1 made its long-awaited return to Japan when Suzuka's circuit in Mie Prefecture hosted the 15th round of the season. It was the first Japanese Grand Prix since 1977, and kind of a weird one. During qualifying, Nigel Mansell suffered a heavy crash that forced him to withdraw from the race entirely. That withdrawal effectively handed his teammate Nelson Piquet his 3rd and final world championship before the actual race had even begun. The race itself, however, was still worth watching. The winner was my fellow Austrian Gerhard Berger in his Ferrari, finishing a comfortable 17 seconds ahead of a rising 27-year-old Ayrton Senna in a Lotus Honda. As for Japan's own and Senna's teammate, Nakajima Satoru, he rounded out a solid performance with a 6th place finish, just shy of the fairy tale result Honda founder Honda Soichiro might have dreamed of on what was after all his company's home circuit. But if the 1987 Japanese Grand Prix felt slightly underwhelming as a title decider, That would not be the case for what followed. Formula 1 returned to Suzuka almost exactly 1 year later in 1988, and this time, history was made. Ayrton Senna clinched his first ever World Championship title here, driving a McLaren powered by a Honda engine. One can only imagine Honda Soichiro-san going to bed that night with a very satisfied smile on his face. But then came 1989. Once again, the World Championship was decided at Suzuka. With the help of some hefty controversy, a collision handed the title to Prost in what remains one of the most infamous moments in Formula 1 history. But surely, lightning wouldn't strike twice in a row, would it? Psst, it did. In 1990, Suzuka hosted yet another championship decider, and once again a collision between Senna and Prost settled the title, but this time in Senna's favor. Then, in 1991, the story reached its emotional peak when Formula 1 returned to Suzuka for the 5th year in a row and Ayrton Senna secured his 3rd and final World Championship title there. A perfect 1-2 finish for Honda on their home track. By this point, Suzuka wasn't just another race on the calendar, it was where championships were decided, where rivalries exploded, and where Ayrton Senna cemented his own legacy. Suzuka Circuit became one of Formula 1's most sacred venues, a place that shaped the sport's history, defined an era, and forever tied Japan, Honda, and one of the greatest drivers of all time together. And it all began right here, with Formula 1's return to Japan in 1987. On November 6th, Japan saw yet another end of an era in politics, when Takeshita Noboru replaced his fellow Liberal Democratic Party heavyweight Nakazone Yasuhiro as Prime Minister of Japan. Those were some serious boots to fill. Nakazone had been the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 1980s, holding the office for a full 5 years, somewhat of a rarity in Japanese politics. Takeshita, on the other hand, his tenure would be considerably shorter. My man didn't even make it into the 1990s, because less than 2 years into his time as Prime Minister, he was forced to resign after being implicated in a massive recruit scandal. More on that in 1988, by the way. So what did Takeshita manage to do during his brief stint in office? Well, quite a bit actually. In a speech to the National Diet, he publicly acknowledged that Japan had acted as an aggressor during World War II, a statement that, believe it or not, is a controversial one in this country. But what most people probably remember him for is the introduction of Japan's very first consumption tax, pushed through despite widespread public opposition. Make of that legacy what you will, but one thing is absolutely undeniable. Takeshita Noboru carried one of the greatest political nicknames of all time. The Last Shadow Shogun. And hey, he earned it too. The nickname reflected his immense behind-the-scenes influence within Japanese politics, influence that didn't end with his resignation either. Takeshita remained a dominant power broker within the LDP until his death in 2000, and reportedly even masterminded the election of Prime Minister Mori Yoshiro from his hospital bed. Love him or hate him, but the man was clearly very passionate about pulling some strings. And for our final topic of 1987, how about a little fantasy? On December 18th, one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time made its humble debut in Japan. After the massive success of Dragon Quest a year prior, developer Squaresoft greenlit a project to create its own role-playing game, one that could stand toe-to-toe with Enix's hit. Leading the charge on this project was Sakaguchi Hironobu, who alongside just 6 other Square employees started work on a game that would ultimately change the company's fate and that of the Japanese gaming industry itself. They called it Final Fantasy. The story behind the game's title goes something like this. If this game failed, Sakaguchi was to leave the video game industry for good and return to university. He made his final attempt here. It was literally his Final Fantasy. Squaresoft too was supposedly on the brink of bankruptcy, staking everything on one last roll of the dice. It's a great story, but it's also not entirely true. Sakaguchi later stated that while times were rough and Square definitely needed a hit, the real reason for the name was far more mundane and actually kind of hilarious. He just really liked that abbreviation, FF. He had the fantasy part locked in and simply needed a word that sounded good in front of it. Final fit nicely, and just like that, the name Final Fantasy was born. But name this, name that, what the people spending their hard-earned yen on a video game really cared about was of course quality. And Final Fantasy, though not perfect by modern JRPG standards, had a lot of it. Deep yet accessible gameplay that worked beautifully on a controller, stunning visuals driven by the unmistakable artwork of Amano Yoshitaka, and of course an unforgettable soundtrack composed by the legendary Uematsu Nobuo. The game was successful enough to spawn a sequel the very next year, and from there, history took over. Within a decade, Final Fantasy had become the JRPG franchise to capture not just Japan, but the Western world as well. Something that not even Dragon Quest ever fully managed, despite its massive domestic popularity. Today, with 16 mainline entries, countless spin-offs, remakes, re-releases, films, and much more, and over 200 million copies sold worldwide, Final Fantasy stands as one of the most successful video game franchises of all time. Turns out that fantasy wasn't so final after all, huh? That, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to babble about when it comes to Japan in 1987. But 1988 is of course waiting just around the corner. So again, consider subscribing if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss out on any future time travel sessions, and check out the Patreon if you like, where the most amazing, most supportive group of people you've ever seen is waiting for you to join them, including the Hockey Gentleman, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lepta, Xoviabu, Tricoat, Javier Soravia, Steve Matsui, Turam, RK0, Todd, Hajime no James, Utku Hussein Kaya, Hypanin, Torian Gales, Michael Smith, CJ and Mary, Midnight Channel, Sierra DC, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Cats and Soup, Jart B-Man, Ben Harradine, Metal Mama, T-Bird, Tom Ericus Prime, Boo Boo Cakes, JR Horse, Ian Farmer, Adeye Akono, and Journeyman 351. To you and to everyone else who decided to join me on this little journey today, I guess I'll see you next year. じゃあ、またね。